Hello, everyone. I have a series of books to share with you today, which is pretty fun. This is a series from British Library Publishing, which has loosely been titled Gilded Nightmares, but it's not always easy to find under that title, but that's kind of what we're going with. It's collections of classic ghost stories. So, if you're a lover of ghost stories, lore, and weird tales, particularly older and more obscure things, you can't go past the British Library selection. There are two series that they print from their own archive of materials, which are loosely gathered under the title Tales of the Weird. So, if you're kind of looking, that's a good search term. So this includes a number of paperbacks, which are quite stylish. They have these dark covers with these like creepy designs on them. They're really cool. And then there are these books, which are beautifully bound hardcovers. So if you're looking for these ones, you can search on their site as Gilded Nightmares, which I think has been a lately added name and was not always their official title. Okay, so my cat is here, being very disruptive today. Sir. I think he thinks because he's a black cat, he has an opinion. He's an authority on the subject, huh? Yeah. Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you. I'm sure he's going to try and eat a cable in a minute. Where were we? So, yeah, the Gilded Nightmares series are really beautiful. They're a book collector's dream, honestly. They're generally collections of ghost stories or supernatural or spooky tales from the archives, often stories that have been out of print since their first publishing or they're otherwise rare or unusual. They're curated around either an author or more recently they've branched out into locations or sort of themes. There have been collections from Arthur Conan Doyle, Edgar Allan Poe, M.R. James, and then places like Scotland or Ireland. The covers generally were originally black with either gold, silver, or iridescent foil designs on them. They're stunning. More recently, other colored covers have been featured. Sometimes this works. There's one of the ones on vampires is like a blood red, which I think is quite fun. But personally, I don't know why they didn't just stick with black. I think that makes for a better collection. I don't know, that's just my opinion. But either way, all the books are printed on thick quality paper, which makes for a lovely reading experience. And some feature little illustrations and details in them. So they're very stylish. It seems like they release about 2 books a year. But I'm not sure about that because I think it's still developing a little bit. There's 2 that came out recently in September. So I don't know if they're doing 2 early in the year and 2 late or if it's just always the 2 a year. But just to introduce the British Library, if you're not from Britain, it's the National Library of the UK. It holds over 170 million items from books, maps, manuscripts, letters, and more. Their collection extends back centuries, and they hold the Magna Carta, a copy of Shakespeare's Folio, and Beowulf. Recent exhibitions there include dives into medieval women in their own words, which is like fascinating, and life in ancient Dunhuang, an important town on the Silk Road. In October 2023, they were the victim of a cyber attack, which they're still recovering from a year later. It was really big news at the time because they didn't pay the ransom, and so the attackers leaked data. And the whole debacle has been called one of the worst cyber incidents in British history, costing £6 or £7 million to recover from. British Library Publishing is their publishing arm. You can buy these books directly from their online store if you want to. If you're in Canada, you can buy most of these on Indigo's store or in Indigo's store. And Amazon also stock them. They retail at about 15 British pounds, which comes to about 33 in Canadian dollars. And yeah, but it varies slightly. Some of them are a little bit thicker than others. So give or take a few dollars there. I've bought some of mine secondhand and some new. Scotland the Strange was recently sent to me by the publisher's North American distributor for review. So thank you to IPG for that. I really appreciate that. And I did a standalone review of just that book in a written form on my blog. But I just wanted to share all of these books with you. I've been meaning to for a while, actually, and I thought this was a good time to do it. Just because they're so beautifully bound, very high quality content. And I just think, as a collector, these are something that would be interesting, to talk about and that kind of thing. Yeah, to me, they're just a book lover's delight. I love when new ones come out. But yeah, I'm also just a fan of a good British ghost story, especially from the Victorian kind of era. And these are really an education in the genre and throw up gems I've never seen before. It's such a treat to see these older stories in print and in beautiful binding like this. It's such a pleasant reading experience. And some of these stories are really hard to find otherwise. So it kind of opens up a world of story tradition that would otherwise be lost. They've introduced me to more forgotten authors, as well as stories I hadn't read before. And yeah. So I don't have all the books in this series. A couple of them just don't interest me that much. And some I plan on buying but haven't yet. From their website, it seems they have 17 titles in total. I have 9 of them. If you look these books up on Goodreads, they're listed as individual books. They're not listed there as a series, which feels like an oversight. I mean, I guess, it is what it is. So the 5 that I don't have is the first ever one, which came out in 2018, which was Gothic Tales of H.P. Lovecraft. This is a selection of tales from Lovecraft, such an influential writer and beautiful cover design. But I already had a nice, fancy, complete collected works edition. So that's not one that I will get. The 5th book in the series was Visions of the Vampire. This one's a collection of vampire stories from the last 2 centuries. This one has a lovely cover design on red. I may pick this one up at some point. I find older vampire stories really interesting. Number 8 was Fearsome Fairies. This is where the series started to lean into dark folklore and dark fairy tales more. Not just the sort of classic ghost story and those kind of authors. The main thing that put me off this one is they chose really lurid colors for the cover. Like, it reminds me of that reflective gear that you wear, if you're riding a horse in the fog or something, or like on the back of bicycles or something. I'm not really a fan. Celtic Weird. This is number 11, or the one that came out 11th. This one is Tales from the British Isles, based around a Celtic theme. It feels less horror or spooky themed to me. I'm sure it's really good. I'm sort of in 2 minds about it. And then number 13, Burial of Rats. This is a collection of Bram Stoker's work. Lucky number 13. I'm sure I'll pick this one up at some point. It looks really cool. I like the cover design. I haven't read that much of Bram Stoker outside of Dracula and maybe like 1 or 2 other things. So probably will get my hands on that at some point. To move on to the ones that I do have and that I wanted to share with you and talk about. As I said, I have 9 of these. I originally planned on putting them in some kind of order of preference, favorite to least, but then I got a bit overwhelmed because I love all of my books, obviously. And I just felt like it was going to be a bit more, opinion, more than objective reasoning if I did that. And I mean, that's fine too, just opinion is fine. But anyway, I just thought I'd do them in publication order. So the second book that they published was The Stories of M.R. James. And I got this one at the British Library when I used to live in London. This one and the Edgar Allan Poe one, which is the next one that they published, are the ones that just sort of started my obsession with this series as a whole. And I love that both of them are black with silver kind of ghostly foil decoration. It's very, very shiny. In person, they are stunning. These two that I have are black with a kind of iridescent silver, and they're really beautiful. I just love them. M.R. James is an absolute ghost story legend, and I love this book. It features 11 stories from him, selected to best show off his work, so it's a great primer, and introduces favorites like Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad, which maybe is my favorite. The Mezzotint, Lost Hearts, Casting the Runes, and more. M.R. James was born in 1862. He was a medievalist scholar and provost of King's College, Cambridge, and of Eton, and he was later vice-chancellor of Cambridge University. So he started a tradition of writing ghost stories and then reading them to colleagues and select students on Christmas Eve. So a Christmas ghost story is a very Victorian Christmas tradition. We all know A Christmas Carol by Dickens. That's a great example. But M.R. James's stories were special. They were not only very well received by his listeners, but they really chilled their readers by dropping a lot of the Gothic tropes that were really popular and grounding them more in a realist tone, which made it a little bit more sort of scary. They feel quite modern as you read them, honestly. On publication, they revolutionized the ghost story form, and M.R. James is considered one of the best English language writers in that genre. I've read every single one of his stories. I love them. They're so, so good. They often involve a sense of strange local folklore or a scholar stumbling upon an artifact and finding that he's haunted. And they have a style and eeriness that really gets under the skin and are truly chilling. Thoroughly enjoyable. So great to read on a snowy evening or windy, rainy October evening. And this is such a great book. It has some excellent examples of his work. It's a really good collection. One of my favorite books in my collection, I would say. And then the third one that they published was The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. This is another collection of stories, of course. My copy of this is black, and I got it, as I said, at the British Library when I was there. But mostly you'll see this one bound in red. So I don't know if they changed the color for later print runs or if the UK editions are black, which would be amazing. But either way, it makes mine feel extra special because it's sort of different. It is, of course, darkly beautiful. Poe makes the list of featured authors in this series as a very famous name in classic ghost and horror type fiction, a founding father of this fiction, if you will. But he's unusual on this list because he's, of course, not British, but American. So the only other time this has been the case so far is the first book they released, which was about a collection of Lovecraft stories. But both authors are from New England. Does New England fit the British theme? Not really. Poe wrote poems and stories about the mysterious and the macabre and died under mysterious circumstances in 1849, much to modern mystery and true crime lovers' delight. In this book, we have illustrations by Harry Clarke and key stories like The Fall of the House of Usher, Pit and the Pendulum, Mask of the Red Death, and more. This is a lovely collection of Poe stories. Like the previous, really good examples of the author's work. A lovely addition to your classic horror library. I think this one and the previous one are probably, I can't really say they're like my top favorites, but they're definitely up there. Yeah, I think there are so many different editions of collections of Poe's work. And I think this is a really good one if you're not looking for like a complete works of kind of thing. So yeah, number 4 in the series was Gothic Tales of Sheridan Le Fanu. On their online store, interestingly, this one is described as being part of a Silver Classic series, which I think may have been an earlier title for this line of books. But if you use that as a search term, nothing else comes up except for this book. So I don't know. It's an evolving thing, I guess. So Sheridan Le Fanu was an Irish writer of Gothic fiction, horror, and mystery stories. Very well known in the Victorian era. He was an influence on later writers in the genre, like previously mentioned M.R. James. He's perhaps well known or best known for the vampire novella Carmilla, which is one of the earliest examples of vampire fiction, at least in the English language, and was an influence on Bram Stoker's Dracula. Uncle Silas and The House by the Churchyard are two of his other well-known works. This book collects 8 of his less well-known and rarely read stories that have a Gothic style, or are Gothic stories, and it demonstrates his excellent sense of atmosphere, pacing, and innovation of the narrative form, as well as being a very entertaining collection for its thrills and chills. Murders, castles, ghosts, they're all here, they're all included. I like this one. I think it's a fabulous spooky read, allowing the author's work to shine and to be rediscovered. And I think it's a really good addition to any sort of horror person's library. He's kind of a harder author to find other than Carmilla. And so I feel like some of his lesser known work is really ripe for discovery. So this is a good one because it's, rather than a sort of, short list of well-known or classics from the author, this is more like, here's things you've never seen from this author. So number 6 in the series was The Open Door, a collection of Margaret Oliphant stories. Margaret Oliphant Wilson, or commonly styled in her time as Mrs. Oliphant, was a Scottish writer born in 1828 who was a prolific writer, wrote a range of stories from things about travel and history to literary criticism and novels. Her life was riddled with tragedy. The only surviving child of her parents, 3 of her own children died. And after her beloved, well, she can't have been the only surviving child of her parents. I think she was the only surviving daughter. Anyway, so 3 of her own children died. And after her beloved husband's death, she had to earn money to support her family. So she was already a writer by then, but she had to work really hard to support her 3 remaining children. Later, another of her children died, and then her brother experienced financial ruin, so she took him in and supported him and his children. Then her remaining 2 sons sort of failed to establish careers or sort of struggled a lot, and then they both predeceased her. And at that point, her grief just overtook her and her health started to decline. So I can't even imagine a life like that, Of course, all of these tragedies listed like this sort of distract from her work a little bit. She had a very interesting and varied career outside of just a list of tragedies. She mentored other women writers. She was a very popular writer and prolific writer. She traveled a lot. She's a very interesting person. I just find it fascinating what people lived through in her era and how strong a woman she was to hold up for so long and through so much sort of relentless grief and tragedy. But to return to her work, it's often been criticized as being in the domestic arena, sort of too domestic. Some of her contemporaries felt that she sort of dashed her work off too quickly and maybe published a little too often. Her ghost stories were largely written later in her career and feel quite remarkable next to her other, more mainstream work. They were published as stories of the seen and unseen in a serial fashion, as was quite common at the time. And they sometimes have a bit more of a sort of religious, spiritual sort of tone than other ghost stories of the era. This volume collects some of her best, and I think is one of the best collections of her work in this genre that you can find. However you feel about her work at large, her ghost and supernatural stories have resonated with readers for many years, and they were part of a revival of her work in the 80s as sort of like Virago Publishing was very interested in her work in the 80s. So it's a great volume. Playing with Fire is a collection of Arthur Conan Doyle's work. I've always loved Arthur Conan Doyle. I love his Sherlock Holmes books, of course, but I've also enjoyed a wider range of his work as well. He's always struck me as a very sympathetic character with his kind face, and the few things I've read about him personally, I've just always kind of liked him. He seems like very wise just from reading his books, some of the sort of things he says in his books. I'm like, that's very astute. But anyway, he was quite interesting, very varied sort of interests. Everything from medicine. He helped absolve a couple of wrongly convicted men. He had an interest in spiritualism and psychic research. He worked in medicine. Oh, I mentioned that. I think people lately like to point out that he was taken in by the Cottingley fairy hoax. And I just think this is a little unfair to reduce him to that. A lot of people were taken in by this hoax, and it was a time when people widely believed in things like messages from the beyond. Spiritualism was very popular. People lost friends and family frequently in those days, and they were looking for comfort and answers. And I think also in the face of the Industrial Revolution and advances in technology, things were changing really fast. And many people wanted to find comfort in nature and older things, older beliefs, a little bit of magic and less machinery kind of thing. The arts and crafts movement and William Morris reflect this rejection of modernity and factory-produced things. So it's not unreasonable with that in mind to understand why someone would want to believe or might be taken in by, or even just why the hoax was so popular. All this to say, while Sherlock stories are very interested in the growing science of what would become forensic investigation, criminal psychology, sort of logic and reason, Arthur Conan Doyle's supernatural tales reflect the other side of his personality and interest, a fascination with the unknown and unknowable, the supernatural, all of that kind of thing. These stories feature encounters with the monstrous, mesmerism, hauntings, and the book also contains an essay by the author called Stranger Than Fiction, which is a nonfiction essay about his own personal experiences, which is really interesting and is such a great thing to include in that book. So, I really like that one too. Then we have Algernon Blackwood. This one's called The Whisperers. No collection of ghost stories or tales of the supernatural is complete without Algernon Blackwood. He was born in 1869, prolific writer of stories in this genre, and Lovecraft quoted him as being one of the modern masters of the genre. He's one of my favorite writers of ghost stories, and this is a really solid collection of his work. The editor, Mike Ashley, is a biographer of this author, and his selection of stories to include is impeccable. Because Blackwood used a lot of his own experiences or those of friends, sort of in his work or as starting places for his work, Ashley introduces each story to explain the origin of the story or the story behind the story, what inspired it, and what it tells us about Blackwood, which allows this book as a whole to sort of function as a biography of Blackwood as well as an anthology of wonderful spooky stories. And I just think that's a really great way to have structured this book, and just gives it an added dimension, which I love. The book includes 16 stories from The Empty House and The Listener to The Wings of Horus and Roman Remains. This one is definitely a favorite of mine. Number 10 in the series was The Little Blue Flames by A.M. Burridge. So this author is one often forgotten to time, well worth the rediscovery, well regarded by other authors in the genre of British ghost or supernatural stories. He represents a move away from some of the more Victorian elements of these stories, or even from that archaeological or antiquarian style of someone like, M.R. James is probably a good example of that. These stories are more modern, published in the 20s and 30s, so they're much more modern than some of the others in this series. In his own time, he was a popular writer of fiction for children, or most especially cheerful fiction aimed at sort of boys. Books were often written that way in this era. But later, and especially following his death, his ghost stories have become more what he's well known for. These stories are wonderful examples of the evolving form and wonderful writer of the genre at work. And the titular story, Little Blue Flames, and The One Who Saw are included to great effect. This one is such a good inclusion in the collection just because it is it shows the evolving form and just sort of adds so much dimension to the collection as a whole. It's a really good one. Penny Bloods, this was number 12. This one is perhaps my least favorite in the series so far. And yet I also kind of got a lot out of it. It's still a really good book. Penny Dreadfuls and Penny Bloods were cheap, serialized, often gothic and sensational fiction from the Victorian era, hugely popular in their day, often contained some pretty bloody and lurid themes. for that reason, I like them and find them kind of fun. They were considered problematic in their own time and often contained some really interesting female characters like nothing seen anywhere else, especially in the time period. Those women, or the through line and theme of this book, are these complex and interesting female characters in Penny Bloods, and there are some really dark and fascinating characters here. The issue with Penny Bloods is that they were written in sort of an episodic form and published in magazines, like kind of like a soap opera would be on TV now, like these kind of, episodic form in a magazine. And if they were popular, the author would draw them out and add more and more characters and subplots to keep filling up that space and make money. Some plot lines would go nowhere and be entirely forgotten, or would just stop dead, so to speak, when the magazine stopped publishing a particular story that had sort of not been as popular or whatever. And there's just like a lot of filler, a lot of meandering, and a lot of just sort of being sensational to get the reader to buy the magazine. This means that while the book is a fascinating snapshot of the genre and it's a great addition to the collection as a whole, it does contain work that's not of the same standard as like Edgar Allan Poe or Arthur Conan Doyle, for example. The book extracts samples of the works of that genre because obviously the whole stories are really long, so you can't include them. So it's like pieces taken from the whole as examples. And so it's sort of not as neatly tied up as others that contain a complete short story. So it's a really good book. If you're interested in Penny Dreadfuls and Penny Bloods, definitely grab this one. It's a really good read for that reason. But it's just in a high standard of company. Where else are you going to find such a solid Penny Dreadful sampler like this? Like, it's very accessible to the modern reader. But yeah, just alongside this series as a whole, it's just become like maybe my least favorite. Still an excellent book, but just in comparison. So then we have Scotland the Strange, and this is the latest one that I have. And this one, as I mentioned before, this one was sent to me by the publisher. So this one is sort of like a course in strange and spooky writing from Scotland, ranging from 1818 to 1875. The word weird in the title implies a bit more in the line of strange or witchy stories, folklore influence, this sort of old-fashioned meaning of the word weird, more than the ghost stories or straight horror that the series otherwise features. The early stories in the collection are reminiscent or influenced by dark fairy tale a little bit more, and they're not the strongest or most intriguing stories. As time goes on, or as the collection goes on, we got a little bit more into the modern era, and the later stories are really quite good. So this volume is a little bit uneven. The editor speaks about his own upbringing in Scotland and how when he was at school, or I'm sure a lot of people experienced this, teaching sort of foregrounded more English writing, and it just kind of goes to show that there's a need for rediscovery of this literature and storytelling tradition. This book is a great way of showing the evolving literature and writing sort of in this arena or in this genre or in this subject in a particular place. And it's very good. Undiscovered Country as a whole, I liked this book, but I just wish that it fit the overall series a little bit better. When I think of reading these books, I kind of think of making a cup of tea and, maybe putting my phone on silent and kind of sinking into something spooky and, that kind of thing, like fireside. I don't know. And, these aren't really scary. I guess they're kind of fireside stories in some cases. And, that's good. I feel like on its own as a book, it stands pretty well, actually. But in this list and in this like hardcover imprint alongside its cousins, it feels a little softer. But yeah, included are some more forgotten or unknown writers, as this series of books tends to feature, which is great. And then it has some well-known people like Robert Louis Stevenson, John Buchan. And I think the editor's introduction and little introduction to each story about what they are, why they're included is really good. And I like it. I do. But I think the problem is some of the books in this series are so strong, and so strong in the selling point or the sort of theming, that this one just feels a little bit, yeah. So that's all the ones in my collection. Upcoming titles that have been announced or have been released. There is Uncanny Ireland, which is kind of like a companion to the Scotland one. And it has the same editor. So I don't know. I'm in two minds about that one as far as whether I will get it or not. Because I just feel like I don't know, you know? And then the 16th one that I'm pretty sure came out in September is Ghost Stories of Wilkie Collins. I love Wilkie Collins, especially The Woman in White. I find his life very interesting. If you don't know much about Wilkie Collins, maybe I should cover him at some point, because he was just a very interesting person, very unconventional for his time period. He was contemporary to Dickens, and they were like best friends. Anyway, I'll be getting my hot little hands on this one. This one looks really good. And I think the books in this series that are themed around an author work really, really well. The 17th one that also, I'm pretty sure came out either this month or last month, is called Halloweird. You know, like Halloween, but weird. This one is themed around Samhain or Halloween. And yeah, it has kind of an autumn feel to the cover, which I think is very interesting. I'll probably get this one. It looks pretty good. Feels like it's going to fit the vibe pretty well. So yeah, that is all of the titles as they currently stand. I really feel like Charles Dickens should be on this list. His ghost stories are very good. I also think a Christmas one, if they're going to do Halloween, a Christmas one would be really good. Though I think they've done quite a few Christmas themed books in the paperback Tales of the Weird list, so maybe they won't do that. I don't know. A London specific one, if we're doing places, a London specific would be really good. And so would Edinburgh, don't you think? Yeah, I think there's a few other sort of semi-forgotten ghost story writers. There's one that used to be published by Dickens in his magazine who I think would do really well. And I can't remember her name, which is going to make her impossible to find because he published quite a few people. But I think she would be really good in here. What do you think? Do you own any of these? Are there any of these that really appeal to you? And who do you think should be featured in one of these books? I would love to know what you think. So please come join me in the comments and chat to me about this, because I highly recommend these books. I think they're really good. That's my take on them. But also, it's just like a genre that I love. So come and talk to me about it. If you want to, please recommend me your favorite ghost story, modern or classic. I don't mind. They're all good. And yeah, if there's anyone who you feel should sort of have their own book in this series, or a book that you know, of their stories you want to recommend, comments. Come and tell me about it. And thank you for joining me on my little journey into this series. I think it's kind of crazy as well that, I mean, now they're sort of calling it Gilded Nightmares, but it seems like it hasn't been listed. You know, if you're looking for something, especially like something that's sort of got a collectible element to it with books, I always feel like having it on Goodreads is, you know, listed, like these are all the ones you can get, is kind of important for people to make them, to people to be able to search them and kind of see what they have and don't have, or what they might like to get. And I feel like that's kind of a missed trick here. Like, it feels like they were going with silver classics, and then it was sort of part of the Tales of the Weird thing that they were doing. Yeah, so I feel like there's a missed trick there. But anyway, thank you for joining me. I hope that you're enjoying your October season, or if you're watching this at another time of year, I hope you're just having a great day when you watch this. And until next time.